Good afternoon, people of grace. For our Pastoral Connect today, I want to give a bit of a preview for this Sunday's sermon by asking one question. What does it mean to be spiritual? I think we often over-spiritualize being spiritual. The term spiritual shows up 26 times in our New Testament, and 25 of them are good. And they refer to our soul maintaining its proper spiritual orientation. Remember that our soul is ourself, and we have a physical orientation, the body in this world, and math and science and logic and the observable, but then we also have this spiritual orientation. And really, spiritual warfare, or being spiritual, is about maintaining that spiritual orientation, because if you are determined to maintain that, you are going to eventually run into the one time in the New Testament that spiritual is bad. And that's here in Ephesians 6, verse 12, where it talks about spiritual evil or spiritual forces of wickedness. And being spiritual is no more or less than maintaining your spiritual orientation and overcoming those spiritual evils, those principalities and powers that would break that. And these principalities and powers are not overcome by our intellect. They're not overcome by our philosophies and our systematic theologies. Those things do not make us spiritual. They're not overcome by our technical expertise of Hebrew and Greek. Really, being spiritual is simpler and more powerful than that. A guy named Alan Kreider wrote a book about the early church, trying to tap into what was it that was the practice of these early Christians that allowed them to spread so powerfully and really inexplicably through the Roman Empire and ultimately permeate it. And really there are four things. And three of them are ones that we can participate in, and they're not complicated. And then the fourth one is something that God does. And the first one is the ability to be patient or long-suffering. Christians viewed that as an absolutely essential, cardinal, hinge virtue, and it wasn't viewed that way as much by the Roman world. We can see why the Christians saw it as so essential. They often suffered. They experienced a lot of loss. But they showed this ability to accept that, to release that, and they did that and practiced that long-suffering, a long-suffering that they saw God doing for people, especially as shown through Jesus on the cross. And so they embraced that, and they showed a very high level of ability to do that, and it was crazy to the world. It made them look weak. But they not only did that and maintained their long-suffering and their patience and didn't quit in their faith, but they maintained what Kreider calls a habitus of life, or what I call an eternal lifestyle, where they had kind of a lightness of being about them, and a joy, and just a positivity, and a sense of being unconditionally for all people, whether believers or unbelievers. They ministered to people during times of plague, even putting themselves at risk. They rescued the abandoned infants. They were just very much for people. They cared for the poor, and they did this so they themselves were often persecuted. And that long suffering, and yet that kind of lightness of being and joy and positivity, was something that the Roman world couldn't explain. It was very attractive to the Roman world. So those were the first 2 points. The third one was that the early Christians were very notoriously stubborn about assembling together. They saw that as absolutely essential to assemble for worship, where they could both praise God and receive instruction, and that they did it physically. They got together, even at times of great risk, where they had to hide in the catacombs to do it. And again, that struck other people as odd. Why would the Christians take such risks just to physically assemble? And that's the part that's a big challenge for us right now, because we can't physically assemble right now. And there's been other times in the history of the church where the church could not physically assemble because of plagues, pandemics. But the challenge is that it doesn't take very long for something to get into your habitus of life, your lifestyle. And some, having not physically assembled for this period of time, will simply let that fall away from their lifestyle. But the early Christians didn't. They were tenacious about doing that. And these three things, their long suffering, their ability to process grief and loss well, and to do that while maintaining a lightness of being, a joy, a hope, and a sense of just being positive and for people, and their determination to assemble together, brought together kind of this almost chemical reaction, what Kreider calls this fermentation, that just spread through the Roman Empire. And that fermentation was what he calls an invisible power. It, you couldn't formulate it. It's just something God did. And he did it using the Christians' long suffering, their positive, joyful servant lifestyle, and their commitment to assembly as means of grace. And that threw the Roman world for a loop because it didn't make sense. It wasn't logical. And it especially showed its power when the ancient world would run into spiritual phenomenon that they couldn't explain, what we would call a demonization. The Jewish exorcists couldn't do anything with that. We see that in Acts 19. The Roman philosophers and statesmen had nothing to say about that. They couldn't touch it. You couldn't think your way out of that situation. And all the different religions of the Roman Empire um, couldn't do much with that. But the Christians would minister to the demonized. They weren't afraid of them. And they actually would show power over the demonic realm. And all of that came out of these simple things. So, being spiritual isn't as spiritualized as we make it. Um, Practice long suffering, be patient. Don't get all politicized and stoked up and angry. We can speak and share our voice if you disagree with things that are going on. But don't think that that's going to get us above the principalities and powers, um, or below them and uproot them. Those aren't the things that do it. And none of these human endeavors of philosophy or theology or politics ever can. It's spiritual. And we need to make sure that we remember that so that we keep our proper orientation, and that becomes an attractive thing to the world. And we can leave the results to God. So I hope that that helps you think about what it means to maintain your spiritual orientation. Be patient, uh, maintain a lighthearted, joyful, positive attitude, and just stubbornly, desperately cling to the desire to assemble physically together again. I look forward to that day with you. And until then, I pray that this has been an encouragement to you as a preview for this Sunday's message. Thank you for giving me your time. I appreciate that. And be spiritual.